so this is let's see. 'Cause I've you want to do here. Why don't I just go ahead and go with today's regularly scheduled programming, as it were. Let me do that. Got so many windows open. Windows of the world open. I gotta close some of these things. Okay, let's do this. Need 1 second. Bear with me. We're gonna set it off, as they say. Okay. I think we're good. Let me just see what happens here. Yeah, I think we're good now. We are good. We're good. Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Robert Phoenix. Welcome to another edition of 15 Minutes of Flame. And so, just to recap, Mueller is on Capitol Hill, and apparently the early returns are that he is sucking wind big time. That he is mumbling, stumbling. Apparently, he called Trump Trimp, and he keeps asking the questions to be repeated. There's a sense that he's running out the clock or trying to run out the clock. So this is a really interesting development in terms of what's going on today. This is the last stand for the Democrats. You know, if they can't somehow find something inside that text and nail Mueller to the text of the report, or the redacted or the non-redacted version, which somebody may have a copy of, then this is it. They're kind of screwed. You know, I think the only thing that's going to be left for them is going to be the Jeffrey Epstein material, which is not insignificant. I mean, there's a lot going on with the Epstein stuff, which we know. We know that there's a ton there. But the thing with the Epstein material is that once you open it, it's like a bomb, a big ass bomb that goes off in a marketplace, and it's just going to take out a bunch of people. There, I mean, once you open Epstein, nothing is controllable at that point. It's like you're. One time I had this van, and I talked about this story a long time ago. One time I had this van, and the steering column went out on it, and I ran out of gas on the van. It was a really not great situation, but I was trying to get it back to where I was living at that time, which was in the flats in Berkeley, and I was up in the hills, and I was trying to get it down this street and push it, and once I got it off this curb, uh, it started to go down this hill and go down the hill without me, and I had to let go of the van. It was just like, get out of the way. And it turned out to be mostly okay, uh, believe it or not. So, but that's kind of the metaphor with the Epstein stuff. Once it happens, you're just gonna have to get out of the way. And I think a lot of people have way, 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 way too much invested in Epstein and the relationship with Epstein and all the tributary relationships in order for it to be used against Trump directly. It could be used against Trump indirectly, and that's a whole different discussion that probably we could have in about 30, 40, 50-minute discussion. But we're not going to have that today. We're going to get back to the rise of the Infesticons, and I'm going to be returning to the scene of the crime, which is the outtakes or the clips that I've accrued from KGB Connections, which is this really amazing documentary that I discovered, and it was made in 1982 by CBC, or the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, in conjunction with the American Broadcasting Corporation. And ABC, even though it was a co-producer, did not air the documentary after it had been finished. This would have been around 1982, because they said, well, there just wouldn't be that much interest around it. Are you freaking kidding me? Americans would have lapped this thing up, and they would have seen what was going on, and they would have understood that this is taking place right under their very noses. And this is all pre-fall of the wall. This is 1982. The wall's not going to fall for another 7 years. But it would have elicited and activated a greater degree of awareness. Now, again, I want to stress that there was a high degree of enabling and a high degree of codependency that was taking place inside the United States government at very high levels in conjunction with the Soviets. Very high levels. The only person who didn't play that game was Jimmy Carter. You know, Jimmy Carter thought that the Russians were making terrible transgressions, being the leader that he was, against the Afghanis when they were having their war in Afghanistan. And there was an Olympics that was held in 1980 that the Americans did not attend, and it was the Olympics in Russia. And Jimmy Carter said, we're not going. Could you imagine that now? We're not going. Even with all the stink that the Americans put up against the Russians during the Sochi Olympics, which is kind of in some ways where all this started. All this anti-Russia phobia, anti-Russia marketing. The Olympic team was going to go. It was going to go. I mean, there was too much money, too much invested, too many network dollars. But the United States Olympic team during the 1980 Olympics didn't go because Jimmy Carter said, you ain't going. You're not going because we don't approve of the Russians' war in Afghanistan. And here we are, 2019, still up to our third eye in opium fields in Afghanistan. My, how the times have changed. We go to the Russian Olympics and we have our own war. What was interesting about the Russian Olympics is that it was broadcast on TBS or TNT, one of the two Ted Turner networks. So you got to watch the Olympics. They were a very dreary looking affair, by the way. I remember watching them. Those were the Olympics when Daley Thompson, the great British triathlete, won the triathlon. Other than that, nothing very remarkable happened during those Olympics. But what did happen, and this is again what Anthony Sutton pointed out, was that there was a high degree of collusion between the United States and the corporations inside the United States with the Russians, and had been for a very long time. And so that collusion extended into spying and espionage. You know, when it came time for the Russians to have their embassy in the United States, they found the place that had the highest vantage point in Washington, D.C., which allowed them to gain the greatest access to the audio signals that they were pirating from their embassy. In turn, when the United States wanted to have their embassy relocated in Moscow, the Russians put it at the lowest point in the city, thereby diminishing the capacity and the efficacy of the United States being able to do the same thing on the Russians. When the Russians requested to have embassy personnel and staff approved of by the United States, almost every single one of them was high-ranking scientists, researchers, or technicians. When it came to the United States sending the same group or similar group over to Russia, they were more along the lines of sociologists, people that had art and history degrees so they could study the fine art and architecture of the Soviet Union. It was not an equal trade-off of personnel. So why was that happening? It was because there were people inside the United States that want to put the United States at a disadvantage. This has been happening for a long, long time, and it's still happening. It's still taking place. There are levels of infestation and collusion that I'm going to be covering over the next few days that extend far beyond what the Russians were doing, although could have been part of a ancillary Soviet slash Russian plan, because there are other groups that are connected. They're doing their own kind of infestation, their own kind of subterfuge of the system. And it continues to this day what's taking place. And it's not just what the Russians did, or the former Soviet Union did, or what the KGB did, or MI6, or Mossad has done and is still doing. Oh no, there's more. Last night I was listening to Jeff Rentz, and he has this guy that comes on about once a week. His name is Gary Holland. And Gary's ex-military. He's actually pretty interesting. Most of Jeff's guests are snoozers, but Gary actually brings some intelligence, some research, knows what he's talking about. And he's been tracking the stuff on the border right now and what's taking place on the border and who's coming through on the border. And the amount of people that are coming from Central Africa is off the charts. Off the charts. They're dropping them in Mexico City, and they're getting them to the border, and they're handing them with rolls of $100 bills and some instructions, and they're basically escorting them across the border, and immigration is picking them up and then distributing them and sticking them in bus stations in places like San Antonio, El Paso, and Dallas. So what's happened is that the UN's resettlement program, the numbers on that resettlement program have dropped. This is the formal program that the UN and the United States has agreed to. Apparently there are countries all over the world that have ongoing agreements with the UN to resettle refugees in their home countries. However, what's happened now is that the State Department has moved in and taken over the distribution plan. And while the numbers are officially down with the resettlement program, they are radically up with the unofficial resettlement program. And people don't understand this. This is another form of infestation. Now, there are people who say, oh, Robert, you're just a xenophobe. Oh, Robert, why can't you just open your heart and just realize these people have a fucked up situation? Well, you know what? These people, the people that are coming from those places, yeah, they're pretty fucked up, right? And we could probably sit here and do a show about that and talk about the NGOs and the multinational corporations, and how every successive generation is fueled by some kind of revolution, some kind of gang lord who gets guns from a country that's supplying them with the guns. Doesn't matter what the country is, they're getting the guns, and then they're doing the bidding of that country, that multinational corporation, that NGO, and then they become the strong man. And this has been going on for decades now. In fact, I'm going to show it to you today, right here with a clip from KGB Connections. So the ability to create a functional society in that part of the world has always been handicapped to a large degree by the people that are trying to help, and they do it on purpose. They do it on purpose. That's why for a large part, that's why most of Africa is a story of non-success. I'm saying most of, not all. Now, of course, the South Africans had a actually very highly functioning society, and of course, it was built on apartheid. It's kind of ironic that it was highly functioning and it had apartheid as a part of it. But I believe there is always a goal inside of the South African government to divest themselves of the apartheid situation. And what they wanted to do is, I think they wanted to create the groundwork and the foundation of that situation, or their basically functional governance in all the systems that are associated with it, which would be the growing of food, the distribution of goods, the extraction of petroleum products, so they can use petroleum products to power their automobiles and their industry, all that stuff, right? This is what I've heard. Well, apartheid ended anyway, and South Africa is struggling deeply, and the people that are living there are struggling deeply. And it's not just the Afrikaners. There happens to be other groups known as the Colors and the Zulus that are really having a very difficult time from the group that basically took over and staged a coup in South Africa. And that's been the story of South Africa, or Africa in general. One coup after another, after another, after another, after another. And what you have is you have a minefield. You go into a place like the Congo, and what do they have in the Congo? They've got these rare earth minerals. What's going on in there? It's destabilized. The Chinese come in, they start mining the shit out of the place. Some people get jobs, but mostly the Chinese bring their own workers in. And what happens to the local environment, and what happens to the very small and meager local economies? They get all fucked up, because the Western world, and now the Eastern world with China, can't blame it solely on the West anymore, wants to come in and extract those resources and not really be that inclusive or build out a structure so that the people there can benefit from it. Generally, that hasn't happened. If you ever want to see an amazing movie, watch a film called Darwin's Nightmare, and that will give you a bird's eye view of what takes place in Africa, how the local ecosystems are completely destabilized, and how the West, in this case the Russians and the Western Europeans, come in and use the local economy and the local sense of injustice and aggression for their own ends. It's an amazing movie. It's very, very depressing. It's extremely depressing, but it gives you a snapshot of how the game works. It has to do with the Nile perch. Anyway, I'm digressing a bit. So why don't I start one of the clips? I'll start with the African clip. But before I get to the African clip, I wanted to talk just a little bit about Hayda Messing, who's the woman. I think I might play another one of her clips today. I wanted to talk about her and one of the things she says in the video, which I didn't touch on yesterday, but I made a mental note to touch on it today. In the video, Hayda Messing basically says that she became aware at some point over the illusion of socialism and over the illusion of communism. She became aware of it, but at that point she couldn't do anything because she was so far down her ideological highway that in order for her to admit to herself and others that she was wrong would have been a terrible transgression of her own spirit. She wouldn't be able to handle it. So instead what she did is she worked out a deal with the Americans and she defected at some point. So that was an option that was available to her. But I think this is really an important piece of the human psyche and psychology that people need to wrap their heads around. So let's say, for instance, you're on the left now, and you realize that basically who you're backing are bunch of batshit lunatic crazies. And you look and you kind of wake up into it, and you go, holy smokes. I'm actually like supporting these people. And you look at the what's happening with the current crop of candidates. Oh my God, they're just falling apart. I was watching Joe Biden. He was on The View. Oh my God. It was terrible. It was so bad. He was so embarrassing. He couldn't string 3 to 4 words together. That's how bad he was. Terrible. And the looks of the woman. Joy Behar is sitting there really rooting for him. And, come on, you can do this. You can do this. You can answer a question and be remotely articulate. Couldn't do it. Some of the looks on the other gals were like sheer horror. Like, what's going on with this man? That's just Biden. Bernie Sanders is now embroiled in a labor dispute with his campaign workers, and his ratings are starting to fall. His money is starting to dry up a little bit. His campaign workers unionized. Isn't that just beautiful? His campaign workers unionized, and now he can't afford to pay the campaign workers. So he's having infighting in his own freaking campaign because they're not making enough money. Isn't that amazing? So he's a Democrat. He's a front. I'm telling you, man, they're in deep, deep, deep trouble. Deep trouble. Pete Buttigieg just came out and said that the biggest terror threat now is white nationalism. White nationalism. It's the biggest terror threat. So they've managed now to shift the so-called terror threat. I say so-called terror threat because there really wasn't a terror threat. They had 9/11 as a terror event that kicked this whole thing off. And then they had a bunch of patsies that they sort of encouraged, enabled, scooped up along the way to continue their weak ass narrative. Well, they're not doing that anymore because now the big bad boogeyman is the white dude. So Pete Buttigieg just come out and said that. And what they're doing, really what they're doing is they're doubling down on white middle America because there are people, I guarantee you, that are not terrorists and not even close, and people that aren't even racist. But you know what they're doing? They're kind of turning them into racists. They're kind of turning them into people who are like, fuck you. Okay, you're going to draw a line. Okay, I'm going to go step over that line, which I don't think is actually a very smart thing to do. But that's what they're doing. So there's this gaslighting that's taking place, and they're very aware of it, and they want to control that narrative. And whoever controls the narrative is generally going to win. That's generally what happens. Or if they don't win outright with their election, they certainly win the manipulation, the engineering of their social paradigm. That's what happens. So, but if you're on the left and you see that, and you have even a modicum of a scintilla of awareness, and you see what's going on, and you look at it and you go, this is nuts. These people are nuts. Why am I investing in these people again? Can you remind me? Can you tell me why? And then you wake up into it and it's like, well, I'm so far down the line. I've got all these friends and I've got all these connections. And over the years, I've given close to $10,000 to the Democratic Party. And I've invested my life in blood, and I go to the meetings and the meetups. And are you all of a sudden going to just do a pivot? Are you going to put on your tuxedo shoes and then get on your front toe and do a 180 and spin in the other direction? Most people won't do that. Most people would rather live with their shame and their regret versus having to admit that they've been wrong. And that is the greatest gift that we have when it comes to truth, is to admit that we were wrong. And there's no harm and no foul in admitting we were wrong. You know, we all do it. We all have to, face that at some point. You think you're adamant and, in the right place, and you weren't. It may have been um, a good but misguided intention, but if you're wrong, you're wrong. And there are people even on the right, like if you're like a, hardcore MAGA head, how can you how can you look at what's going on with immigration and support that? Really support that? You can't. You just can't. As much as you would like to love Donald Trump and the sort of the great white hope that he's brought to the presidency, when you look at really what's going on in the border and the inefficiency, the lack of the follow through on the promise to build a wall, how can you support that? At some point, you have to say, I was wrong about this guy when it came to this subject, this topic, this really important piece. He's let us down. He has not come through on his campaign promise. Probably not the only one. There's probably more. He did stop the TTP. God bless him. God bless him. He has been a thorn in the side of the climate changers. God bless him for that. But even on the Trump side, you have to come. You have to keep score at home, right? You have to admit that. If you don't admit that, then again, you're succumbing to the same kind of blinder thinking that the left is, or that the left does. So this is a really important part of this topic. This is the first process of healing, to realize you were wrong. And it can even be like a diet, or some level of habituation, like social drinking. I thought for a long time that was really cool. I was wrong. I had to admit that to myself. It could be your food, it could be anything. And once you figure it out, then you've got to live with the truth. Truth is a naked blade, let me tell you. All right, let me play this now. I'm going to set the stage for you. And this has to do with what, here we go, Russian influence. We're setting the stage.
Lead now to the zone. And just after the Essex Toll Plaza,
Yeah.
you'll see the phone booth, public phone booth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the second phone booth from the right, if you look at in front of you, after the booth. Just under the shelf, you'll see the small box, okay?
Okay.
As always. And follow the instructions completely, and you'll find everything there, all right?
Okay.
Okay.
Right. I'll talk to you later.
Okay,
Right.
bye-bye.
The head of the KGB, operating out of the Soviet mission to the United Nations, has been identified by Shevchenko as V. Kazakov. Within the UN, the Soviets are also able to exert influence. Viktor Lesyovsky is a KGB officer who occupies the post of Special Assistant to the Secretary General in the United Nations. He chooses the speakers for the debates in the General Assembly. Vasily Solodonnikov is another KGB officer who served as a senior secretariat official. A man who served with Solodonnikov at the International Relations Institute in Moscow was Igor Glagolev, who was an advisor to West before he did.
High-ranking, they control the staff of the United States.
Solodonnikov was an advisor to Joshua Nkomo and other leaders during the war in Zimbabwe-Rhodesia. He is now a key formulator of Soviet policy in Africa and is their ambassador to Zambia.
Later on, he was assistant to the Secretary General, and later on he was director of the Institute of Africa. And now he's the Soviet ambassador in Zambia, where he masterminded the takeover of Zimbabwe, and now he's organizing the takeover of South Africa.
Okay, so what you were watching there was sort of how the Russians were, it was a revelation on how the Russians were getting involved in the takeover of South Africa. They certainly took over Zimbabwe, and they were key in the revolutions there that they were behind the scenes. The United States does the same thing, okay? Does the same thing. We get into this idea of regime change. I mean, really, what it is, it's really the sort of the Russian, it's the so-called democratic version or the American version of revolution, also known as regime change, right? It's exactly what it is in our own freedom-loving version, right? So for whatever reason now, the screen has gone black. Let me go over to the 15-minute side, see what's happening. Yeah, I'm talking there. And let me go over to the YouTube side of things. And let's see. I am blacked out. Totally blacked out over on YouTube. Okay. Let me just do a refresher there. See if we can catch up with the broadcast. Give me 1 second. Yeah. Looks like I've hit the void over on YouTube, the black void. Very interesting. Well, YouTube has decided, I believe, I'm back. There I am. We've got the lag time. It's the lag time. Okay. So, again, I just wanted to show you the infestation. And it's not just, it wasn't just here in this country. It was global. And of course, we have the CIA, we have the NSA and our groups that do the same thing. But right now, I'm just looking at the infestation in this corpus. Okay, so the next clip I'm going to play is revolution related, and it has to do with the Weather Underground and Bernardine Dohrn. So this is a really interesting clip, and it talks about the communistic and socialistic influence with the Weather Underground. The Weather Underground also, by the way, was working, believe it or not, with the CIA, because they were getting huge amounts of LSD and using LSD as a form of revolutionary indoctrination. It was the radical sacrament. Okay, so let's get into Bernardine Dohrn and the Weather Underground, and then I'm going to show you through these clips the connections and how, to a large extent, the unrest of the 1960s was fueled by both the Russians and the CIA, but I'm focusing mainly on the Russian side of things. The CIA side of things, we all know, was MKUltra. Okay, here we go. Here's Bernardine Dohrn.
In the 1960s, Bernardine Dohrn was one of the leaders of the violent radical group known as the Weathermen. On December 3, 1980, in Chicago, Bernardine Dohrn surrendered after 10 years in hiding. With her was another weatherman, Bill Ayers, with whom she had been living. They held a press conference and stated their continued commitment to radical change.
Resistance by every means necessary is happening and will continue to happen within the United States as well as around the world, and I remain committed to the struggle ahead.
The man with Bernardine Dohrn, Bill Ayers, was one of the key members of the Weathermen during the 1960s. A man who knew Ayers well during those years was Larry Grathwohl, a former member of the Weather Underground, which had developed close ties with the Cubans.
Well, when the Cubans viewed the revolutionary struggle in the United States, they recognized the fact that the left as it existed in 69 and 70 was not capable of overthrowing the government by itself. Consequently, they had hoped that the group itself would be able to attack the system from within and provide assistance to the international movement, the international communist revolution. As a weatherman, if I became cut off from the main body of the organization, the Weather Underground organization, I could make contact or reestablish contact by going to the Cuban embassy in Mexico or Canada and asking to, as an example, I wanted to get in touch with Bernardine Delgado. That was the code word, Delgado. And I would tell them that I'm Larry Delgado and I can be reached at such and such a phone number or at such and such an address, and the Cubans would make the connection and put me back in contact with the
How do you know this?
I don't
How do you know this information?
Bill Ayers gave me those instructions in, it was either February or March of 1970 in Detroit.
The Cuban DGI is organized into 7 departments and subdivided into geographic sections, the largest one being the United States section. It controls North American operations, including the UN, diplomatic posts, and radical groups. During the 1970s, hundreds of young Americans circumvented U.S. travel regulations to go to Cuba to harvest sugarcane and experience the Cuban Revolution firsthand. As a cover for the recruitment of the weathermen, the DGI organized the Venceremos Brigades. The organizers, tour guides, and hosts were officers of the DGI who used the occasion to train young American radicals. Cuban intelligence was well prepared for the Venceremos Brigades when they arrived.
Every time that a Venceremos Brigade contingent arrived in Cuba, all the operational of the DGI had to drop what they were doing and go to work on the Venceremos Brigade. We had to investigate, collect background to see who could be recruited, what information could be obtained.
Do you know of young Americans who were recruited in the brigade to work for the Cuban intelligence who came back to America and were secretly working for the Cubans?
Yes, and they are still working.
Still working for the Cubans in America?
Yes, definitely.
The brigade was established with the sole purpose of providing a cover for the weathermen to get their people to Cuba for training. And that's why it existed. As a matter of fact, when our people came back off the first Venceremos Brigade, in I think it was February of 1970, the criticism that the Cubans had made about the Venceremos Brigade indicated that the majority of people being sent there, they felt were useless. They really weren't helping them harvest sugarcane. But that it was justified in the sense that here was a means to train and politicize weathermen contacts and weathermen.
Cuba somehow had the ability to bring out in young people at that time the feeling of communism with a mambo beat, or somehow that what was happening in Cuba was totally different than what was happening anyplace else in the world.
This was the main reason of the interest showed by the Russians in trying to control the DGI, because the Cubans could work far more easily than the Soviets.
Weren't the weather people aware that they were being used by the Soviets in some way?
No, they view the Cubans as being the vanguard of the international communist revolution. Now, the vanguard essentially means that the Cubans are at the very tip of the spear. They're the leadership. The Russians are being used by the Cubans. Now, this is the weatherman's rationalization of this interaction between the Soviets and the Cubans. The Cubans said, you've got to become active. You've got to start doing things. And planning a national action to protest the beginning of the Chicago 8 trial and to commemorate the riots during the Democratic National Convention of '68, and to protest the war in Vietnam is not action. Action requires that you confront the system violently. So when the weathermen got back from Cuba, they changed the national action to the Days of Rage.
blaze of rage in October 1969 was an attack on the city of Chicago and its police department. For 4 days, anti-war protesters, urged on by agitators of the Weathermen, rioted in the streets, engaging in violent confrontations and pitched battles with the police. Quebec during the 1960s was rocked by terrorist bombings and confrontations between the police and French-Canadian separatist demonstrators supporting the FLQ.
So back from the darkness, back from the void. Um, I love that. I love that. Communism with a mambo beat. So Cuba played a role in terms of attracting the type of revolutionary spirit that perhaps the old guard in Russia could not. And the Weathermen, who were basically spoiled ass rich kids, they were convinced that it was the Cubans who were running the communists slash Bolsheviks and not the other way around. And the fact of the matter is that the Cubans were an appendage of the Russians, obviously. But that's that allowed the Weather Underground to get involved and to throw their revolutionary spirit behind the Cuban front. It's exactly what happened. Because if the Russians were supposedly behind it, they would have been so uncool, right? Totally uncool. Larry Grathwohl, by the way, was an informant. He worked for the FBI, and he had infiltrated the Weather Underground, and he passed away in 2013. Now, in terms of Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers, they're in respectable positions, and it's been my contention for a while now that the left won. They totally won. Everything that they wanted to do in the 60s, they won. And that's the capstone of the left was the presidency of Barack Obama. And once Obama became president, all the kind of institutional and revolutionary party ideas that Obama stood for became integrated to some extent inside the body politic of the United States. Started with Obamacare, which is basically socialized medicine, even though you have to pay out the ass for it. It's the worst of both worlds, to be quite honest with you. But we got that, and then of course we got his agitprop radical program known as Black Lives Matter, which was straight out of Alinsky 101. So the left won. They had reached the pinnacle of power from from the place of a facade. What we would consider the pinnacle of power being the President of the United States, but everything that was kind of associated and behind him, which was his cabinet and all the people in the cabinet. Bill Ayers made something like 50 trips to the White House during the time Obama was president. Bill Ayers wrote his first book, Dreams of My Father. There's another guy involved also with that Obama book as well. No, that's somebody different. Sorry, my bad. It was Bill Ayers. And Bill Ayers was one of the architects of Common Core. So we can see the fulfillment of what took place in the 1960s and 1970s. Somebody in the chat room was talking about how they were given respectable positions after they did their prison time. Absolutely. Bernadine Dohrn still teaches at Northwestern University, if I'm not mistaken. Mark Rudd, he teaches at a community college in New Mexico. Probably still very active in CPUSA, just as they all are. They all. And if you look at the corporate involvement in communism and socialism, it's been there from day one. The corporate involvement helped, build the tanks that Stalin would use in his fight against Hitler, in the legendary battle against Hitler in World War II. They were basically using American tanks and the importation of American parts and all the stuff. When the Soviet Union was basically looking for wheat because they were starving because they couldn't grow shit. With all their collectivism, they still couldn't feed their people. They were buying wheat from the United States. They were getting it at dirt cheap prices, discounted prices. So when we look around today, we see the upside down world that we're talking about. Why do you think it's an upside down world? Do you think it's just because it's hip? Do you think it's because it's cool? Because they're pandering to the millennials and the millennials to buy their shit? No. We're looking at the upside down world because corporate America has always been deeply embedded in this fabric of creating a one world order. And the one world order being disguised as this kind of bipolar effort between the opposing forces of fascism, who are bad, and the other force that opposes fascism, which is socialism, communism, which is theoretically good. And again, when you watch the documentary, you see this theme come up again and again and again, over and over again. That's what happens, right? Oh my God, we've got to stop fascism. So let's take up the good cause. It's weak. It's a totally weak dialectic, but most people fall for it. They fall for it because most people can't think independently in and of themselves and for themselves. Because in order to do that, you've got to say no to certain things. You've got to say no to programming. You've got to say no to certain people who are infested with the programming, who can't get out of their intellectual and philosophical loop. And it becomes a lonely journey at that point. Good news is we get together here, a few days out of the week and talk about it. I had a really interesting reading yesterday with a wonderful couple from Joshua Tree. And, their lament is not an uncommon one. And their lament was that, we've divested ourselves of a lot of people because philosophically, ideologically, religiously, politically, spiritually, we're just moving past them. We're unshackling, the velvet handcuffs of the new age. We're unshackling ourselves from politically correct thought. We're unshackling ourselves from the liberal politics that is based on some kind of generically weak feel good, right? So these people, as they unshackle, what do? They find themselves more and more isolated because more and more people, or fewer and fewer people, can fit into their social and personal constellation. And that is a theme that I have experienced a lot through this process. I get emails all the time from people who basically are very happy that, I get up here and I do this a few days a week. Because at the very least, there's a voice, that's out there that says, hey, you're not alone. And you're not alone. And there's more people who are going through this process and waking up. The big problem is how dispersed we are and dislocated we are. That's the big issue. And we've